Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Beethoven's Fidelio with conductor Markus Poschner, which I saw at the Staatsoper unter den Linden. This marks the second time I saw Harry Kupfer's production of Beethoven's Fidelio at the Staatsoper unter den Linden because I wanted to see and hear Sally Matthews tackle the role of Leonora. I've been following Sally Matthews' career for quite a long time. I mainly knew her in a lot of the Mozart repertoire, especially as a lyric soprano singing Countess Almaviva, Constanze, and Pamina. Outside Mozart, she sang Silvia from Thomas Aday's The Exterminating Angel, Lauretta from Puccini's Gianni Schicchi, and Blanche de la Force from Le Dialogue de Carmelite. So she was essentially a lyric soprano with decent coloratura skills and a well-established career overall in the lyric soprano repertoire. However, these days, as I was researching through Opera Base, I found out that Miss Matthews has been tackling heavier roles, such as Bellini's Norma, Elisabetta from Verdi's Don Carlo, tonight's Leonora from Beethoven's Fidelio, and an upcoming Sieglinde from Wagner's Die Walküre. I had every reason to be extremely skeptical with how Sally Matthews was going to fare as the Fidelio Leonora because a naturally lovely lyric soprano voice like Miss Matthews can't really hold out with these dramatic, big singing roles. And I also had every reason to fear for her vocal security because of what weights a normally lovely lyric soprano would end up enduring as Leonora, which is a very dramatic sounding role, and her chances of lasting with these weights would have been extremely slight. My fears were quite realized in terms of how she performed the role. But first, some positives of how Sally Matthews fared as the Fidelio Leonora. Yes, I did enjoy how she was able to tackle this role with charm and with sufficient charisma, as well as the nervousness that she has in this situation, disguising herself as a boy under Rocco's service in the state prison to find out some really dark secrets lurking around there, and then showing some vulnerability. And then from that vulnerability comes that strength to rescue Florestan. So these were aspects I really enjoyed about Sally Matthews' performance as the Fidelio Leonora. She was even brave enough to lunge at those top notes and managed to sing some decent chest tones here and there, but that's where my praise ends, because although she did a fine job in characterizing Leonora and how she was able to make her this vulnerable yet very strong woman willing to risk her life to save her imprisoned husband, her voice, as I stated before, did not suit the demands of this otherwise dramatic soprano role. In order to try to sing as dramatically as possible, Sally Matthews ended up screaming, shouting, yelling, and just barreling through the role with her natural lyric soprano voice that just ended up being compromised from all of that shouting, all of that forcing, and all of that pushing. And this is also the result of trying to take on a lot of these bigger roles these days. Roles such as the Fidelio Leonora, Norma, Elisabetta di Valois, and her upcoming Sieglinde have pretty much loosened Miss Matthews' vocal cords to the point where she not only sounded loose, but she was wobbly. She was screaming all those notes out with what very little voice she had. She didn't coordinate head voice and chest voice. And worst of all, she lacked core that is necessary to not only master dramatic singing as the Fidelio Leonora, but also arguably in what she was able to accomplish throughout her entire career. In fact, that lack of core made her pretty inaudible in the lower parts of her voice. And when she had to sing those high notes, she sounded quite painful when doing so. Even when she was trying to have a go at these huge dramatic passages, I couldn't help but feel really sorry for Sally Matthews because her natural lyric soprano voice is not built to last, let alone endure with these huge weights that are weighing down on her voice. Vocally speaking, Sally Matthews' performance as the Fidelio Leonore was quite a train wreck to the point where I felt really bad for her. She was gutsy enough to take on this role, but when your vocal cords are loosening and your vocal cords are just trying to scream for help just to not have all these crazy weights weigh down on you, you know that something needs to be done in order to rectify it, let alone just step away from big dramatic roles such as the Fidelio Leonore. Just please give me real hochdramatische sopranos, let alone Falcon singers such as Rose Pauli, Kirsten Flagstad, Gertrud Rünger, Annika Netzny, Helena Braun, Erna Schlüter, Hilde Konetzny, Walburga Wegner, Margaret Harshaw, Martha Mödel, Gertrud Grob-Brandl, Astrid Varnay, Birgit Nilsson, Ingrid Steger, Sigrid Kehl, Ludmila Vorakova, Nadezhda Kniplova, Gwyneth Jones, Hildegard Behrens, Janice Martin, Krista Ludwig, Shirley Verrett, Deborah Pulaski, Gabriele Schnaut, and even to some people, Waltraud Meyer. Those singers, whether they be dramatic sopranos or even high mezzos who can also do dramatic soprano roles, those singers really had the appropriate sizes and voices to tackle the Fidelio Leonore. Sally Matthews was underpowered, overparted, and sounded painful when trying to tackle the Fidelio Leonore. She didn't have enough voice to last with this role, and when she tried to sing as dramatically as possible, she was forcing it all out, and the results were unsatisfactory. Sure, she did act the part well, but acting the part well is only half the battle. You also need to have the appropriate heft, let alone the big size to sing over that orchestra, which Sally Matthews struggled with everything she tried to give. If I were to give her some piece of advice, she should take a few steps back. Stop singing roles like the Fidelio Leonore, Elisabetta, or even Norma and her upcoming Sieglinde. She should just take a few steps back and just continue with the lyric soprano roles of Arabella, Zante from Strauss's Die Liebe der Danae, and of course continue the likes of Countess Almaviva, Fiordiligi, and maybe even Don Elvira. Those roles are far more appropriate for Sally Matthews considering her natural lyric soprano voice. She should do herself a favor and preserve what is left of her natural lyric soprano voice and just stop singing these roles that are otherwise way too taxing and way too much for her voice to handle. At least she was able to theatrically tackle the role, but vocally speaking, she should just look elsewhere. Evelyn Nova continues to be the best performer of the evening, especially when it came to the main women. Proclaiming that Evelyn Novak had the correct sound and the correct mannerisms for Marcelline is a mere understatement. Evelyn Novak was perfect for the role, both vocally and theatrically. The fact that she was able to take advantage of her creamy, lovely toned, and silvery lyric soprano voice to make the role of Marcelina her own is outstanding and extremely laudable. She has been singing this role for what has to be about 7 to 10 years, and her vocal art and her vocal commitment to make Marcellina come to life is absolutely peerless. One could argue that she could have a little bit more heft a la Lisa della Casa, Irmgard Siegfried, and Sina Jurnats, who are my personal favorite Marcellinas, unless I forget about singers such as Elsie Morrison and Gundula Janowitz, because I love many a full lyric soprano, let alone a light lyric soprano, tackling Marcellina more than the coloratura soubrettes who find themselves singing this lovely role. In fact, Evelyn Novak was not a soubrette soprano at all. She was a lovely lyric soprano who was able to make the best out of Marcellina's music and do so with grace, aplomb, charisma, and charm. So she definitely deserved A pluses all around for making Marcellina such a charismatically charming character to witness on stage, all thanks to her naturally gorgeous and purely toned lyric soprano voice that was just so sweet and so lovely to listen to, and of course, appropriately correct for Marcellina. Andreas Chaga strikes again as Florestan, and his voice definitely grew in incision and in power. I do wish for a little bit more roundness and richness a la Hans Beire or Gunther Treptow, but that is kind of asking for a bit too much because Andreas Chaga's vocal prowess continued to shine like the brightest of diamonds. Yes, his vocal flaws of singing maskily, as well as having that wobble in his voice, which is due to him trying to sing as big and dramatic as possible in the Wagnerian repertoire that he has been very well known for, i.e., Siegfried and Siegmund and Lohengrin and Parsifal. However, despite whatever vocal flaws Andreas Chaga had, whether it be the wobbles, or singing in the mask, or not always maintaining an oval-shaped mouth when he hits those high notes, his dedication to his craft, and how he was able to let his voice ring throughout the orchestra has always been a major asset every time Mr. Chaga stepped on stage to just sing the absolute heck out of Florestan. So I still have to give him a lot of kudos for everything that he accomplished as a fine dramatic tenor, even though some of his vocal resources were a bit all over the place. But I could still forgive them because his strong vocal presence more than compensated whatever vocal flaws he had, and he was able to sing with all of his might, especially when it came to his solo aria, Gott welch dunkel hier. He sang with power, he sang with might, and he sang with incision. What more can you ask for from someone like Mr. Andreas Chaga? Florian Hoffmann was a decent Giacchino. Yes, I'm still not so crazy about his nasality, but he was still able to sing his music well, and yes, I still wish for a nicer, heftier sounding lyric tenor a la Rudolf Schock and Waldemar Kment, but in terms of Florian Hoffmann's vocal performance as Giacchino, he was still solid all around, and he looked tall and elegant on stage as he's always been. I also have to give a good amount of kudos to Sungu Lee's finely sung and finely tuned First Prisoner, as his lovely tenor voice was absolutely sweet to listen to. Christoph Fischesser's Rocco was solidly sung thanks to his basso cantante voice being a fine asset to this role, even though he did show signs of singing with a bit of a tremolo here and there, as well as singing rather throatily. I've been following Mr. Fischesser's career ever since I was a teenager. The fact that he was able to sing basso cantante roles from the Italian repertoire, such as Sir Giorgio Walton from Bellini's I Puritani, and even sing the likes of Klingsor, Titurel, and Gurnemanz from Parsifal, as well as König Heinrich der Vogler, just demonstrates how surprisingly versatile this basso cantante was. And here he was singing as Rocco, which he has been maintaining in his repertoire for many years. His Rocco was solidly sung. He was able to play the part well with some sturdiness and stoicism, but also a bit of that lovable daddy figure that he was to Marcellina. However, his throatiness was an issue for me because, yes, he does have sufficient darkness to sing the role of Rocco, but when it's marred by a throaty projection, that's where the problem starts arising. In fact, just give me real, dark, and more cavernous basso profondo voices such as Gottlob Frick, Josef Greindl, and Herbert Alsen, who were just as fantastic as Rocco, and lest I forget about Desse Ernster, although I'm not so crazy about the wobble that he developed much later in his career, but he still had that cavernousness that made him stand out so well as Rocco and many other basso profondo parts that he sang throughout his career. With Christoph Fischesse, yes, I still miss a lot more darkness, a lot more heft, and a lot more manly virility with more basso profondo depths. But Christoph Fischesse's fine charisma and wonderfully sung basso cantante voice, although it was quite throaty, still managed to win me over as a fine performer, and he was able to accomplish this role quite well with everything that he's got. Roman Trekel as Don Fernando, I've been very conflicted with because while he had the strong stage presence and while he was tall and elegant on stage, I was just not crazy about his throatiness and his wobble and how many tremolos that he was producing, especially given that he was a natural lyric baritone trying to sing this basso cantante part. And whenever I think of basso cantantes, let alone bass baritones, who sang as Don Fernando, I always turn my attention to Martí Talvela, although he was more of a basso profondo, Theo Adam, and Karl Kaman. Those were real, cavernous, and more squealo-laden voices ideal for Don Fernando. Even though I was not a fan of Roman Trekel's wobble and him trying to sound a lot darker in terms of just trying to reach for those low notes, at least he still had a fine stage presence to make Don Fernando a compassionate authority figure. Thomas Thomasson was another solid singer for Don Pizarro. He had the appropriate bite and the appropriate ferociousness to make Don Pizarro come to life as a character, and I was quite impressed with his rendition of Ha, welch ein Augenblick. Yes, you could argue, yes, I do argue that there have been better interpreters of Don Pizarro, such as Hermann Ude, Hans Hotter, Friedrich Schor, Gustav Neidlinger, who is actually my number one favorite Don Pizarro of all time, and another personal favorite of mine, Paul Schöffler, who is also tied with Gustav Neidlinger as my personal favorite Don Pizarro of all time because they had squealo, because they had natural darkness, depth, and richness in their voices. With Thomas Thomasson, yes, I do understand that part of that throatiness and part of him trying to sound a little bit more dark in terms of his vocal projection was due to his past as a basso cantante before heading toward the more bass baritone / Heldenbariton roles. This was a gentleman who essentially started out as Ferrando from Trovatore and Raimondo from Lucia della Mermur before having a go at Klingsor from Parsifal and Telramund from Lohengrin. Yes, he had sufficient darkness. Yes, he had sufficient bite to make Don Pizarro such a fearful character. However, his throatiness and how he was trying to sound big with his throatiness holding him back, leaves a little bit to be desired. Nevertheless, I still enjoyed Thomas Thomasson's overall menace and bite as Don Pizarro, as he was a convincing singing actor who made me just fear him, but also love him in terms of what he was able to pull off as Don Pizarro. So I still have to give him a fair amount of kudos, even with his vocal flaws that can be found in his throatiness and how he just tries to let his voice out, but there were occasions where he felt like he was having his wings clipped. Nevertheless, Thomas Thomasson did a laudable job in making Don Pizarro come to life. Another piece of special acknowledgement also has to go to Sung Jin Lee's finely sung Second Prisoner, all thanks to that baritone voice of his being put to fine use. So overall, the singing did vary in quality, and I say that as a nice euphemism. Sally Matthews was undervoiced and completely underpowered as the Fidelio Leonora. Her natural lyric soprano voice was never intended to be pushed to these extremes, let alone these dramatic extremes. She was trying to push whatever lyricism she still mustered just to try to make the role of Leonora her own. At least she did try to do everything she can as an actress, let alone be involving in the drama, as well as embodied Leonora's nervousness and determination to rescue her husband from doom. That I could still give credit to, but vocally speaking, she might as well just turn away from the likes of Leonora and just not even touch the dramatic soprano repertoire, let alone roles that are way too taxing for Miss Matthews, because the results that I heard tonight were not really that good for her voice. At least the likes of Evelyn Novak's charmingly sung Marcelina, Andreas Schaga giving power and might to Florestan, and Florian Hoffmann's finally sung Giacchino, unless they forget about the fine efforts done by the two prisoners, sung by Sungu Lee and Sungjin Lee, were finally done. And in terms of who the best performers were tonight, among the ladies, Evelyn Novak's charmingly sung and beautifully spun out Marcelina, and in terms of the men, it was none other than Andreas Schaga's powerful, mighty Florestan, even though there were some reservations made about how he was trying to project his voice, as well as singing a bit too much in the mask. At least there were also other solid singers who did fine jobs in their roles, even with their vocal flaws, such as Christoph Fischesser as Rocco, Roman Trekel as Don Fernando, and Thomas Thomasson as Don Pizarro. Even if the qualities of singers did vary from not really being satisfactory in Sally Matthews' case to being absolutely excellent in Andreas Schaga's and Evelyn Novak's cases to just being okay, such as the cases of Christoph Fischesser, Roman Trekel, and Thomas Thomasson, even though Thomas Thomasson was still very good as Don Pizarro, at least everybody managed to work together in order to make this performance of Fidelio worthwhile to some viewers and listeners. The conducting done by Markus Poschner was sufficiently involving, as he did make sure to keep the tension of the music, he made sure to keep everybody together, and he did what he had to do in terms of nuances, as well as not rushing too much, let alone dragging too much of the music, and it was moderately paced. And what more can you expect from the chorus, the orchestra, and the extras of the Staatsoper unter den Linden? Everybody did a fine job and propelled tonight's performance so well. While I was unimpressed with Sally Matthews tackling Leonora, and while I thought she was way too undervoiced and way too underpowered to take on this otherwise dramatic soprano role, I could still give her some credit for not only tackling this role bravely, even if her vocal resources do not match the vocal demands of Leonora, as well as doing what she can to portray this role with everything that she's got. Even with all of her vocal flaws, even with all of the issues that I've had with her voice, such as not having sufficient core and not having sufficient coordination between head voice and chest voice, at least Sally Matthews can be lauded in terms of her bravery, although she might as well just turn away from the more taxing repertoire and stick to the lyrical repertoire that she has been singing for many years. At least this evening's performance was bolstered by Evelyn Novak's charmingly sung Marcelina and Andreas Chaga's powerfully sung Florestan, unless I forget about the fine efforts done by Florian Hoffmann's finely sung Giacchino, Christoph Fischasser being a fine Rocco, Roman Trekel being a dashing yet kind of mixed bag of a Don Ferrando, and Thomas Thomasson just singing everything that he can as Don Pizarro, even with his issues of throatiness and his issues of sounding a bit wooden in some areas. At least Thomas Thomasson was a very involved singing actor who gave his Don Pizarro a lot of bite and a fair amount of richness to boot. And for those of you who saw this performance of Beethoven's Fidelio at the Staatsoper unter den Linden, what'd you think of it? Did you feel that Sally Matthews was just way too underpowered and way too undervoiced as Leonora? Did you still enjoy her performance nonetheless? Was there a singer who stood out to you so much, whether it was Evelyn Novak as Marcelina or Andreas Chaga as Florestan? Or did you feel like the singing was not to your liking? Please comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Beethoven's Fidelio, starring Sally Matthews at the Staatsoper unter den Linden. Tune in next time for yet another review, let alone in November, where I have a series of reviews at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. So until then, good night everybody, and have a wonderful Halloween season.